Welcome and good afternoon. It's my pleasure to welcome you to today's event, Pope Leo XIV and the Future of the Roman Catholic Church, sponsored by the Institute for Islamic, Christian, and Jewish Studies, located in Baltimore, Maryland. We're also known locally as ICJS. I am Heather Miller Rubens, the Executive Director and the Roman Catholic Scholar here at ICJS. We are an independent educational interreligious nonprofit founded in 1987, and we've worked for nearly 4 decades to build an interreligious society where dialogue replaces division, friendship overcomes fear, and education eradicates ignorance. We do this by creating interreligious communities of learning in the greater Baltimore area. Through public-facing scholarship and relationship-focused educational programs, we create interreligious learning opportunities where people who believe differently can connect and learn with one another. For more information about ICJS, please visit our website, icjs.org. So on May 8th, thanks to the wonders of technology, people around the world saw the white smoke coming from the Sistine Chapel at the Vatican, and then heard the words, Habemus Papam, from the balcony of St. Peter's Basilica. With this Latin phrase, we have a pope, the world was introduced to Pope Leo XIV, the latest pope for the Roman Catholic Church. Today, we will talk about the election of Pope Leo XIV, the first pope born in the United States to lead the Roman Catholic Church, with 2 leading theologians and Catholic experts. I'm delighted to introduce today's panelists. First, Dr. Stephen Oakey, who's an associate professor of theology and the director of the THD program at St. Leo University in St. Leo, Florida, where he teaches courses in Catholic theology and ethics. He earned his master's degree in theology from the University of Chicago Divinity School and his PhD in systematic theology from Boston College. He is the author of A Theology of Conversation, an introduction to David Tracy, published in 2018 with Liturgical Press Academic. His research interests are in public theology, Catholic social teaching, and technology. Dr. Annie Selleck, she, her, hers, is an expert in feminist ecclesiology. Guided by a feminist methodology, Selleck integrates the lived experience of women with a robust vision for the church. Selleck serves as the director of Georgetown University's Women's Center. She earned her PhD in systematic theology at Boston College and an MDiv at the Jesuit School of Theology at Berkeley. Selleck has over 15 years of experience in Catholic ministry, and her writing has appeared in Modern Theology, the Journal of Catholic Social Thought, the Washington Post, National Catholic Reporter, Commonweal, and America Magazine. Her forthcoming book, The Wounded Church, with Fordham University Press, puts forth a vision of the church in the shadow of wounds and is guided by a feminist methodology. Dr. Selleck and Dr. Oakey, thank you both for joining us today. It's an honor to have you here.
Thanks for having us.
So in today's conversations, I'm going to talk with Dr. Oakey and Dr. Selleck for about a half an hour, and then we are going to take questions from the audience. So please enter all of your questions into the chat. ICJS will be collecting them throughout the entire presentation, and we'll try to get to as many questions as possible. All right, so we'll start at the beginning. I think we want to have a conversation about Pope Leo XIV's life and ministry before becoming Pope, and think a little bit about his biography. And in particular, there's a lot of interest and a lot of analysis about what does it mean that we have a Pope that was born in the United States. So what do you, each of you, think it's important to know about Robert Pvost before he becomes Pope Leo XIV?
So there's a lot right off the bat from once Pope Leo XIV was elected, everyone started doing digging, right? And at first it was he's a Cubs fan, and then it's no, his brother set the record straight, he's a White Sox fan. We're getting all this info about him. And so I think one, that shows the novelty of this, right? Like there's things that I recognize in his upbringing. I think when I look to, so he grew up in Chicago, had 2 brothers. The things that are really interesting to me are that many of the places where he was formed, like his childhood parish, his school, they've all closed recently. right? And I think so. To me, what that says is that his experience as a US Catholic is a fundamentally American Catholic experience, right? There's part of me as a theologian, part of me as a person who I'm like, but I wanted to go visit those places. I think of the way that Pope John Paul II is revered in Poland.
Mm.
And I wanted that in Chicago, right? But I think the closing of parishes is telling of the US experience. So that's one place that I start. Yeah. So what about you, Steve?
Yeah, I would agree with those points. I was reading up a bit about like the home parish, and like that it has gone through a series of mergers, and the building that would have been like the last building for that parish is still around, but is in disrepair. But since his election, now there's interest in trying to preserve it, and people have looked into getting it like landmark status and whatnot, simply because of this. So I think that part, and the way, like he's sort of been like right ahead of or right behind institutions closing in his process. It gives him a good sense into the sort of questions of decline of like U.S. Catholic institutions, like the number of people practicing religious life in the United States. The other thing that I would add in terms of timing is I think it's good for us to reckon with. He's the first pope whose like entire formation process as a priest, etc., takes place after Vatican II, and so he's a kid still when Vatican II ends, and so I mean it surely he has some memories of the 1962 liturgy, and of the sort of transition into the new mass and all those sorts of things, but like while he's in minor seminary is when you're having the new liturgy be rolled out, and by the time he goes to college, like the sort of debates and discussions about Vatican II, the spirit of Vatican II, the implementation of Vatican II are all already underway, and I think his formation already takes place in that kind of time. Whereas for Francis, he was already in priestly formation and Jesuit formation during Vatican II, and then previously, Benedict XVI was a advisor at the council. So,
And that actually brings up another really good point that I'm really drawn to is his formation at Catholic Theological Union, right? So this is a small union in Chicago. I have my mug here that they rolled out. The Pope studied at CTU. But this is a type of place where lay people and priests were in formation together, where there were people from all different Catholic religious traditions together. He was ordained to the diaconate by Bishop Tom Gumbleton, who is a bishop who was really known for his commitment to social justice in Detroit. He was really active in nonviolence, outspoken advocate for women's ordination. In fact, at the ordinations at CTU, there was a demonstration by Robert Pvost's classmates in favor of women's ordination, with women standing up saying, I am also called to the priesthood. So while all the reporting on this is very clear, there's no evidence he participated, right? It's really interesting to think that he was being formed in this time of collaboration, of creativity around what the church can and could look like, that there was a real liveness to theology, that the church wasn't something that we inherit, but something that we live out every day. For those of you who have seen the movie Conclave, right, I think the most often quoted line from that movie is the church is what we do next. The church is what happens next. And I think that very much, one, his brother confirmed that he saw Conclave in preparation for Conclave. But two, there's this sense of liveness to the church, which I think really is in line with that. He was a child when Vatican II was coming around, right?
Oh, these are excellent points. I want to just do some translation work for those who are not Catholic in our interreligious learning community. So we were talking a little bit about his kind of experience as a child in his parish life. So parish is where you go to church. And then the move that he made to minor seminary, which is a move, he made a decision to discern a priestly vocation at a very young age. And so actually went into a minor seminary or a high school age seminary as his next step, which I believe was in Michigan as well, which would also, and then he moves on to Villanova University. And he's also discerning joining the Order of Augustine. And so I'm wondering if you could also maybe comment. We talked a little bit about CTU, Catholic Theological Union in Chicago. If you could comment on his experiences at Villanova and maybe about the Augustinian Order and how the charisms of that order might influence his papacy. And maybe Annie, I'll go to you first.
Yeah, so a few things that we know about the Augustinian order, right? So this is an order of Catholic priests. And as the name suggests, they are animated by the life and ministry of St. Augustine. So a few things that I think are important from that are one, friendship is really important to Augustinians. Friendship is vital. And that's not to say that Jesuits or Franciscans don't care about friendship, right? But there's a role that friendship takes in the Augustinian order that is rooted in the life and writings of St. Augustine. But the ways that I already see this like popping up in Pope Leo's papacy are he's chosen a few people, a staff around him that were from his ministry in Peru, including one of the cooks. Like the main cook will be a Peruvian woman. So I think that to me also strikes me as like, oh, this is a person who truly values friendships, who values relationships, that takes a unique role in his life. Another thing theologically that's really important about the Augustinians is this concept of being on the way somewhere, a concept of being on a journey somewhere. So many people might be familiar with the quotation from Augustine of, our hearts are restless until they rest in you, O Lord. That it's both you're journeying away from something, but you're also journeying towards something bigger than you. So you're on the way, you're in community on the way. So I expect this concept of journeying to be really central. I expect that to pop up in his writings, but I also expect that to pop up kind of in who he surrounds himself with, in what type of visits he does around the world. That this concept of journey, I think, is going to be something that we're talking about for a long time.
Can I ask a follow-up question, Dr. Selleck, on that? I think that's a really important idea, the idea of journeying both personally, but also being in an accompaniment mode with other folks on the way. I'm wondering, do you think that will be an innovation, or do you think it will be carrying forward things that maybe Pope Francis and Pope Benedict and John Paul II did? Because I also think of them, at least also Francis maybe and John Paul, as being folks who were also movers and shakers, as it were. So do you think it's an innovation, or do you think it's a kind of continuation?
Yeah, I mean, the fun part is a month in, all we can do is wildly speculate. This is
Yes.
great, right? This is the fun time to do theology.
And we will.
Yes.
And we will. I think it might come out as a style.
Yeah.
So for instance, when I think of Pope Francis, one of the things that stands out the most is his style, right? And by that, I mean the way that he would go rogue and pick up babies, or he was always having fun. You kind of never knew what he was going to do next. I think what we might see with Leo is more of a style of this like walking together, journeying together, which I will say, and I think we're going to talk about later, is part of the synod. So the synod has been this worldwide gathering of the church that has been around since the church has been in existence, but was reinvigorated in a special way under Pope Francis. This is where we saw real life questions of women's roles in the church, of interreligious dialogue, of ecumenism come forth in a really particular way in the past 3 years in particular. So Robert Pvost participated in that. In his introduction from the balcony of St. Peter's, he talked about the synodal way of being church, a church on the way. So I don't think it'll be this, revolutionary, new, never done before. But I think the way that he talks about the church journeying, the way he journeys maybe with leaders of other faith traditions, I expect his style to be really unique. And I'll also point out too, in this, like in your introduction, Heather, when you were talking about, part of the mission of ICJS is that friendship overcomes fear. Like that also strikes me as something that we might really see movement from Pope Leo on, about how do we talk about friendship as a way of journeying forward. So that's a really exciting thing for this community in particular to dream about.
Thank you for that. I want to ask another follow-up question and then go back to Steve. But I know, Annie, you've been really deeply involved in the synod process, both through Georgetown and through the church more broadly. I'm wondering if you could sort of talk about it with an interreligious audience in mind, sort of what Pope Francis started, and then wildly speculate about where you think it might go next. So.
Yes. So again, the synod is this ancient practice that used to be the way when the church was, throughout the world. Every few years, all the bishops or the local leaders would come together and talk about a topic. This had kind of fallen out of favor. And then the more recent practice was that it was just bishops gathering. And what Pope Francis did was expand who could be at those tables, and in fact, change it from being in an auditorium where everyone was just sitting in rows looking forward to these round tables within the Vatican. And so we had, there was a college student who just a couple of weeks ago graduated from St. Joseph's University, Julia Oseca. So she was one of our representatives from the United States, right? A college student was one of our representatives. We also had another college student attending, Wyatt. So this, who could vote was radically changed and opened to make it more expansive. But also I think what happened in a change was, again, the style change. It was less about, hey, we're going to come up with an authoritative teaching document at the end, and more about, there's something special happens when we gather together and listen. It essentially was a way of asking the question of, like, how does the church listen to one another? So that's a very different posture from the church. So my wild speculation about what that might look like is that, so one, we know with Robert Pvost, one, he participated. Two, he participated mainly at the Spanish language tables as well as the English language tables, but he was really a representative of the church in Latin America. So as we're talking about what it means to be an American pope, I think he comes in with an understanding of this very broad sense of being an American pope, right? Not just being a US born pope, but an American pope from all the Americas, and maybe continuing the line of Pope Francis, who was an Argentinian pope. So I think there's things to play with there. The other part is that I think he's going to continue a lot of the reforms around the synod. So I think he seems to enjoy having lay people in positions of authority. So Sister Natalie is one of the most high-ranking women in the synod office. So that's something I'm curious about. Also something that Robert Pvost wasn't involved in, but the synod was involved in. So when I was in Rome, I went with a group of about 100 college students from all over the US, and we went to just be a part of the synod. We didn't have an official role, but we wanted to encounter and have conversations with the synod delegates. So we would have dinners and we'd have conversations in the spirit, or these like discernment conversations. And on the last day, they invited us into the synod hall to have questions, to ask questions of two of the cardinals who were in charge of the synod, and two lay women who were participating in the synod. And one of the students from Georgetown was chosen to ask a question, and she asked a question about interreligious dialogue.
Mm.
The group that Georgetown brought was interreligious. And so she asked, this is something that we're seeing, like my generation, she was a 21-year-old student. She said, I have experienced the church, I've experienced God in many different religions. And that when religions come together to like a dialogue, I also experience God there. Can you tell me about your experiences with that and what we might hope from the synod? And the responses to that where two of the cardinals really talked about their own experiences with interreligious dialogue. So on the one hand, I think people can be really frustrated with like, okay, no, actually, you all are the ones in power. You can make authoritative statements and say, this is the way, this is the path going forward. But on the other hand, there's something kind of radical about the sense of decisions in the church being grounded in lived experience. And so that's something I find a lot of hope in. And I think that's something we're going to see a lot, is that people's experiences of interreligious dialogue will become the grounds for where they talk about interreligious dialogue. It won't be starting with the documents, right? It'll be starting with the dialogue of life. It'll be starting with like the dialogue of lived experience. So that seems to be an opening to that.
One fun fact, and we might actually throw this in the chat, Bishop Dennis Madden here in Baltimore, he and I led an official synodal interreligious listening session, and then collected and submitted a report both to our local diocese and to the United States Conference of Catholic Bishops to try to bring an intentionally interreligious framework to the process. So we had a small part to play, I'd like to think, and what was heard going up, at least from the American delegation. So I want to go back, Steve. I was thinking about our interreligious audience and Conclave and the movie Conclave and the election process.
Sure.
What is something that you wish everybody knew about papal elections and the Conclave process?
Sure. I think as I was thinking about this question, because I've talked a lot with people about all the different processes and rituals and rules and history and everything else. And I think actually the thing that I most want to sort of emphasize is the conclave process, like so many other things in the Catholic Church, is highly ritualized and has a long and complicated tradition. And it fits well with a lot of things in how we talk about Catholic Christian history, where there's a certain stability to the conclave process. And so for about 800 years, the church has had cardinals as the ones who elect the pope. Like that part has remained pretty stable. But it has also had adjustments and innovations and changes over that same time. And so, like, so for example, like in the intro, Heather talked about, white smoke and all this sort of thing. The white smoke has only been a thing since like the early 20th century. And prior to that, the only time there was smoke was if there was no election. And so if there was a lack of smoke, that was a sign. But the smoke, even that only goes back to the 19th century. And so all of these sorts of things that are like, I would say are very cool and neat. There's a developmental process to it. And I think too, it's important for people to recognize that like so much of what has driven the development of the election process has been these sort of two impulses. One, sort of earlier in the history, was to compel cardinals to decide. And so there's a lot of early conclaves where the cardinals just wouldn't pick someone. They would last for months, even years. And, while all these cardinals are kind of hanging out in Rome or in their, titular churches nearby, they're being provided for by the people, and the people are getting sick of, paying the cardinals tabs. So like the idea of them all being locked in the room originally comes from you can't leave until you decide. But the other side of it is the other impulse is this, strong resistance to outside influence on the conclave. And there's a long history in the Catholic Church of close ties between the church and, the king, the emperor, the state, the prince, whatever it might be. And there was even a sort of like de facto tradition where some like Catholic monarchs could effectively veto a potential pope. Um, but there was this effort to keep the cardinals sequestered and keep information out so that there was not this kind of outside influence. And so even today, when they went into the Sistine Chapel, there's electronic signal jammers, so nothing gets in, nothing gets out. When the cardinals start the conclave, they hand over all of their devices, right? They don't read any outside news, anything. And so they have no idea what is going on. And there's not supposed to be any, like, they're sequestered the way a jury, like more so, I think, than even a jury is, right? And it's to keep that kind of outside influence. In large part because, part of the theological and spiritual claim about the conclave is that the cardinal electors are supposed to be guided by and open to the prompting of the Holy Spirit. And these like efforts to reduce outside influence are ways to sort of create the conditions where that openness is more possible.
Were both of you surprised that an American was chosen, and why or why not?
For me, and I think this was sort of the general received wisdom, was that the perception is the U.S. is so powerful politically, economically, militarily, that to then also have the head of the Catholic Church and have this kind of spiritual authority be American, just kind of looked bad or was kind of a taboo for the cardinals of the world. And so, I mean, I know when I would talk to reporters the death of Pope Francis, I would say, like, this is one of the things that's, not going to happen is an American pope. And some, like, Ed, even like Cardinal George had this thing about, they will never elect an American until the U.S. is in decline. And so that was such a sort of strong impulse for a lot of people that, yeah, it was not at all on my radar going into the conclave.
Annie, were you surprised?
I was shocked. I mean, up until a minute before he came out on the balcony, I was saying I was with a group of students. We were in the Center for Social Justice watching the election. I was going through, okay, here's my vote. Here's who the press thinks. Here's who this, and it will never be an American. Never, right? Like it just felt like it was off the table because of the power dynamics, right?
Yeah.
So I think there's a lot of conversation now of was Robert Pvost elected in spite of his American identity, because of his American identity? Is there again the sense of a larger identity of being associated with Peru or the Americas as a whole? So that is something that I think we will see coming out. I would imagine he'll probably do some nice sit down interviews with the press and address that head on. But I think for now, it radically reorients our idea of power and what power can and should be within the church. But two, I think back to the conclave, right? This shows that the conclave is really something that Catholics would say is guided by the Holy Spirit, but that it's something that we can't predict from the outside. That when a community gathers together in prayer, that is something that all bets are off at that point. We know that he was really widely respected. Some of the info that's coming out, the New York Times has been doing some really great reporting of how Pope Francis seemed to be elevating Robert Pvost and made him in charge of, he was basically the cardinal who would choose all the appointments of bishops throughout the world, which is a really powerful position. So in retrospect, it seems like, oh, okay, maybe we should have been able to predict this a little more. But it seemed disqualifying. So I think, again, right, as someone who studies authority and power in the church, what that says to me is things that we thought were disqualifying are not. And things that we thought must be true are not, right? With Pope Francis, no one ever thought that a Jesuit, as a member of the Society of Jesus, could be elected as Pope, and he was. So with this contemporary papacy, we're seeing a lot of the things that were definitely, I had always been taught were off the table, are now on the table.
Yeah, I would add two things to that. One is my own wild speculation is that one of the reasons that made him a strong candidate for the cardinal electors is that although he's American, like he's also not that American in a certain sense. And so if you look at his career in the last 40 years, he has spent nearly that entire time outside the US. And so he spent a lot of that, most of that in Peru, and then the rest of that he spent in Rome, both as like the I think the prior general of the Augustinians, and then in the Curia as the head of the Congregation for Bishops. And so I think that that made him, acceptable and attractive in a way that like other cardinals who are like very clearly American cardinals, whose names were tossed around, would probably not have been as much. The other thing I would add, and this goes back to the conclave process, is he was elected on the fourth ballot, which is fast. And so it's not unusual. Francis was the fifth, and Benedict XVI was the fourth. But that's generally a signal that like they know it coalesces very quickly that he would be elected. And so that also suggests that there was pretty strong support from him from the beginning, but that even many of the other candidates who would have gotten votes, like if you watch the movie Conclave, you see like in the early ballot, there's tons of people who get votes. They coalesced very quickly around him. So.
One thing that jumped out at me when he stepped out on May 8th was his chosen papal name, Leo the 14th. And I'm wondering if you could speak to the significance of that choice of his papal name, and maybe you could tell us a little bit about Leo the 13th. Maybe go back to Annie and then Steve.
Yeah, so Leo the 13th was one of my favorite popes. So, right, is that normal to have favorite popes?
Yes, entirely.
So this was something, as soon as that name was announced, I was like, okay, like we're in for a good ride. This will be good. This will be good. So why do I have such a high opinion of Leo the 13th? So Leo the 13th wrote an encyclical, or a really authoritative teaching document called Rerum Novarum, which was an encyclical about people say it basically started Catholic social teaching. He wrote it in the time of the Industrial Revolution and was writing about things like child labor, about the dignity of work, about the right to unionize. So things that right now that at a certain point, seem like givens, like the church should be against child labor. That was radical at the time, right? Basically, Pope Leo the 13th was taking a look at the world and saying, okay, the Industrial Revolution is changing the way that we think about the human person. It's changing the way we think about work. It's changing the way we think about dignity, about community, about how society comes together. And the church has something to say about this. And it has something to say really firmly on the side of dignity. So, well, of course, what's our wild speculation? Well, the not so wild speculation, I think everyone's in agreement, is we think that Pope Leo the 14th's first major encyclical, or the real part of his teaching, will be about the AI revolution, right? What is the digital revolution? What does it mean to be human in the midst of machines? What does it mean to be human and care for our world when there's such a high environmental impact of AI? So the AI revolution is what I see to be the analogy to the Industrial Revolution. So this is something that I think will be a huge hallmark, but also the fact that he is naming himself after Leo the 13th shows that, right, he's not just going to write about AI, but like this is the church must say something to this reality. The role of the church is to speak to this reality and to create an environment where there's really a strong voice towards human dignity and towards human connection. And what does it mean to be in solidarity with people throughout the world who you may not know, but you're still in relationship with? I think that really is our signal from him that this is his number one priority.
That's great. And just for context, Leo the 13th was Pope from 1878 to 1903. So when Dr. Selleck was talking about sort of child labor, the end of the Industrial Revolution, that's the time frame that his papacy was in. I really loved the point, Annie, that you made about AI and sort of dignity of work and dignity of humans. I'm wondering maybe, Steve, if you could either take that further, but if you also want
Yeah.
to go back to talk about Rerum Novarum, that's okay too.
Yeah. So I think one of the ways I would like help explain, I think the significance of the name is to look also at the predecessor and successor to Leo the 13th. And so his
Mhm.
predecessor was Pius the Ninth, and his successor was Pius the 10th. And the thing that they most clearly have in common, besides their shared papal name, is they were both very, very opposed to anything that seemed modern, liberal, anything else, right? And so Pius the Ninth was very opposed to liberalism. He famously publishes this syllabus of errors of things that Catholics cannot hold, and it includes things that we think of as part of a sort of standard Western democracy, like freedom of religion and freedom of speech and these sorts of things. And then Pius X also publishes like a condemnation of modernism as a way of thought. And I'm not saying that like all things modern are great. I'm saying that their postures towards all things modern were essentially oppositional. Like they saw themselves as against it. And for Leo the 13th, it was much more a sort of nuanced and critical posture, but also an like awareness of this is the culture. The role of the church is to transform it and leaven it, not simply to fight against it. And so I think one of the sort of expectations I have for Leo the 14th, especially around something like artificial intelligence, is not simply some sort of like condemnation or some sort of rejection, but like a deliberate effort to think through it as Catholics in a world in which, Catholics are less a part of the population, are less significant in some ways than they would have been in the context that Leo the 13th was working in. And so I think to build on what Annie was saying about AI and Rerum Novarum, Leo the 14th has explicitly linked these. And so when he talks about Rerum Novarum, he then talks about AI. Like he's clearly making the connection. And so I agree. I think his first encyclical is going to be on AI, and I think it's going to be like very explicitly framed in terms of Catholic social teaching. And
Mm.
so I think a lot of the focus is going to be one on the dignity of work and the rights of workers and the impact of AI on work in a lot of different ways, many of which are still sort of unknown. And I think it's also probably going to draw on, there's a vein of thought in Catholic social teaching that talks about what's called integral human development. And the idea of integral human development is recognizing that people face and populations face many different challenges, especially in terms of poverty and material well-being and those sorts of things. But that part of the church's view of Catholic social teaching is that that's not the only dimension of the human person. We have to attend to the emotional and physical and spiritual needs of people, and so we have to recognize when we do works of service, it's not just about like giving things to people, right? Like solidarity is not just writing a check. It's like being in relationship with people in a way that is deep and meaningful. And so I expect that that's one of the things he's going to want to respond to in terms of the impact of AI, not just on our works, but on our relationships with people. And so we see, like stories now about people, they have difficulty making friends or difficulty finding significant others, and they develop these sort of parasocial relationships with Chat GPT and that sort of thing. And like, that's not healthy. And so I expect these are the kinds of things he's going to address. I think the caveat or concern that I have is whenever the church has weighed in on technological questions for decades, sometimes more successfully than others. And when it's more successful, it's usually because it's predicated on guiding principles and sort of fundamental theological claims, and less on specific forms or states of technology. And so if he were doing an encyclical on AI 3 years ago, it would be a different world in terms of AI, but I would hope that a lot of the fundamental premises and concerns would be the same.
That's great. I'm just looking at the time. I'm realizing I should probably shift to audience questions. It looks like there's a lot coming in. Again, please do send them to the submit questions here dialogue partner. I think some folks might be sending them directly to me. I actually can't see them. So please, if you submitted them to me, recopy them into the submit questions here. So here's some questions from the audience today. As an American Catholic, I'm amazed at the ways in which Pope Leo has become a viral sensation. The ways we see photos of him as a child, as a young seminarian, the interview with his brothers, both his Chicago brother and his Florida brother, and the memes. Is this because it's 2025 and our online culture? Did this happen in earlier elections with Benedict or with Francis? Is this because he's American?
Uh, my answer to all of that is pretty much yes.
Yeah.
And I mean, for a couple of reasons. So one, you have to think about there for John Paul II, there's going to be fewer pictures of him as a child, like just in terms of both the culture in which he grew up and the technological limits of the time. Like, so there's just going to be differences on those kinds of things. Number two, he's the first pope who had like private, personal social media before he was elected. And so there's like, I mean, I think it's all been deleted, you know, although everything on the internet endures forever. But he had a Facebook page, right? He had a Twitter page. He interacted with people. And so there's already that kind of thing to it. And then the third thing, I mean, I used to live in Chicago, and so I love seeing all the Chicago related memes, but I think a lot of it is, especially in the US, like people have a sense for what certain, you know, regions or cities are like. And so when you see the sort of Chicago related ones, and my personal favorite is him out on the loggia with the old style banner, you know, below, like if you're familiar with Chicago, it makes a lot of sense. So
Yeah, I mean, I have my Chicago
Okay.
Sun-Times da Pope, right? This is
Yeah.
uniquely American, right? I mean, I do think whoever was elected Pope, there would have been more memes, more digging, more fascination. Even in doing panels prior to the lead up of the election, one thing that I was saying was, you know, now, as soon as the person's elected, we're all going to go digging. We're going to find homilies on YouTube, writings. We're going to find all these things. And let's not jump to a conclusion yet, because how someone is as a priest or a cardinal might not be how they are as a pope.
Mhm.
Right. So I think there was a sense of whoever it was, we were going to just have access to that person
mhm.
in a different way. Yet, I mean, again, with the fact that even Heather, you introduced like the Chicago brother, the Florida brother, and we all knew what
Yes.
that meant, right? The fact that there's been a lot on, you know, his brother's social media pages and things like that. Who among us does not have a family member who we would not want their social media pages on the front page of the news, right? So I think there is something like inherently relatable as well.
Here's another question from the audience, and it is reflecting on this vision of not only what does it mean to have an American Pope, but what does this mean about America? So an inversion of this, and one of the participants today latched on to Steve, your point about the church will only elect a Pope from the United States if the United States is in decline. And so do you think that you could comment a little bit further about the
Yeah.
decline of the US overall, or is it the decline of the American church?
Yeah. So like in thinking about the quote that I was pulling from Cardinal George, like the vehicle for that quote being in the discussion is Bishop Barron, who's a like a well-known Catholic apologist and so forth. And it was funny because when he mentioned that before the conclave elected, you know, Robert Prevost, and then he mentioned it again after, and he said like his quote was like, you know, obviously the cardinal electors felt differently, you know, something to that effect. And the thing is, like, I don't know that I would jump to that conclusion. I don't think that it's a reflection necessarily of the reality of whether the US is in ascent or decline or whatever it is. But I think it's possible. I think it's worth considering that, like, maybe many of the cardinal electors do see the US as sort of less important, less significant in certain respects culturally, or see the U.S. as a, as a mess in some kind of ways, and that made them more open to an American than they previously, at least typically, had been. So I don't know. I'm not in the Cardinals' heads, but my speculation is that for a lot of them, the state of the U.S. was such that they were less concerned about there being an American pope, but also an American pope who is not as clearly identified with America, the way like a Cardinal Tobin in New Jersey would have been. So
I'm wondering too, again, a point that was made earlier in the conversation, that the last 40 years he's been in either Peru or Rome might have played in a sort of sense that he's always not that American, right?
yeah.
The edges of his Americanness have been worn off by his global interactions. But just going back, I want to spend a little bit more time on his ministry in Peru, because we skated over that, and I think it might be worth going back to a little bit. And one of the questions from the audience is focusing on the influence of liberation theology, both as it was taught at CTU and as it was lived in the Latin American church. And so I'm wondering if either of you could speak to that. Maybe Annie will go.
Yeah, I think for me, this is a real curiosity. I don't know how much we have to back it up at this point, right? So liberation theology is really associated with Latin America in the 80s, when there was a lot of violence and war, and people like John Sobrino and Ignacio Echeverria and Gustavo Gutierrez were writing about the call of the gospel, the call of the church to be on the side of the poor, and that God is not separate from that, but God lives in the poor. So we can imagine that, yes, this was probably part of his education at CTU. And of course, that would be part of the life of the church in Peru, that the local church in Peru is animated by liberation theology, but also is animated by things like ecclesial-based communities, or ways of the church really being carried on in small communities by lay leadership, and not the priests, not just the church as the hierarchy, but the church as the people of God. Some of the images, right, as we're talking about images, some of the images from Peru, the one I've seen most often is him in his muddy boots walking through the flooded streets of his area. So I think also those aspects of the real lived reality of the local church, that he was not someone who was in, some bishop's mansion far away, but he was there in the muddy water, dealing with the direct impacts of ecological devastation. I think those are parts of it. But again, this is one, like, as we're thinking about his first encyclical and things, like, the first thing I'm going to do, well, the first thing will be read the title, right? And what does he name it after? What are those names? But the second thing I'm going to do is look through the footnotes, right? Is he in dialogue with liberation theology or not? What might that be? So I think at this point, it's more of a curiosity than anything we know for sure. His doctoral dissertation was on canon law. So I think a lot more people have been reading through that. Again, there's a great New York Times reporter looking at that. She's like, I did not read my spouse's doctoral dissertation, but I did read the right. So I think I have not read his doctoral dissertation, but my understanding is it's like a pretty solid analysis of canon law. Right. So he is not a liberation theologian. So I don't want us to make him into something that he's not.
Right.
He was a canon lawyer, like he was an administrator in the church. But you've got to think that this is something that he understands, not in caricatures, but in the lived reality of it.
Yeah, something I would add, because Andy mentioned Gustavo Gutierrez. He was himself Peruvian, and he's really sort of like the godfather of this whole movement. And part of why Gutierrez ends up in the United States and ends up entering the Dominicans and being at Notre Dame for so long is death threats. And so part of the time that Pvost was in Peru, like there was violence, there were disappearances, there were all sorts of terrible things. And so I would imagine he's pretty familiar there. Liberation theology sort of broadly has a complicated history in the Catholic Church in terms of the way the sort of magisterial, and bishops and popes and whatnot have responded to it. Gutierrez has tended to be one of the ones that the church has been more accepting of or open to. And so, for example, Cardinal Mueller, who used to be the head of the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith and was sort of later one of the more conservative critics of Francis, was also a close friend of Gutierrez and wrote forewords for his books and whatnot. So I think it'll be interesting to see if there is reporting on sort of like what to what extent liberation theology was, both part of the curriculum that he studied or had an influence on his work.
And another question from our community is focused on interreligious dialogue and ecumenical dialogue. So interreligious, specifically Catholic Muslim and Catholic Jewish, but then also just thinking about dialogue with other Christians. I see one comment come through that was pointing out that Martin Luther was also a member of the Order of St. Augustine. And so what does this potentially mean that we have an Augustinian Pope for Lutheran Catholic relations, which is a lovely thing to think about. I just wanted to read a quote, though, before asking you both to reflect on that kind of dialogical impulse, or maybe in addition to, I think, Annie, you mentioned earlier, journeying, that I think Pope Francis really focused on encounter and sort of called us to create theologies of encounter and what does it mean to encounter people. But Pope Leo XIV references Pope Francis in his formal address to representatives of other churches, ecclesial communities, and other religions within since he was elected. And he has this lovely quote: "Now is the time for dialogue and building bridges. I am therefore pleased and grateful for the presence of representatives of other religious traditions who share the search for God and his will, which is always and only the will of love and life for men and women and for all creatures." So could you reflect on the dialogical impulse to other Christians and other religions?
I think for me, I think I'm just genuinely curious to see how this will play out for Leo XIV. I don't have a great sense that this had been a significant part of his, prior work. Whether running the Augustinians or as bishop or in the dicastery for bishops. And I don't know enough to say what the sort of culture of this would have been like in Peru. Whereas by contrast, with Pope Francis, for years before he was elected Pope, he had this longstanding relationship with Rabbi Skorka in Argentina and had published with him and so forth. So I don't know that I have like the sort of like a basis on which to make judgments, but he clearly seems to want to continue the path that Francis was working on. And I know a lot of that for Francis as Pope was tied to like he built close relationships with like Patriarch Bartholomew of the Greek Orthodox Church, and with the Grand Imam of Al Azhar, I think, as well.
Yep. Mm-hmm.
And so I think it'll be curious to what Annie was saying earlier about friendship, to see how he cultivates those kind of relationships with other religious leaders.
Yeah, and a few other things I would point out with that. One is that his motto, so each pope chooses a motto. His motto is about unity. It's a quotation from St. Augustine, that's in the one that is Christ, we are one. So this sense of unity. So I think that's part of it. That's part of what I'm looking for. And how does he understand unity? And when he was speaking to representatives of other churches and ecclesial communities and other religions, he said, unity has always been a motto of my central concern, as demonstrated in this. So I think that's, he's telling us like, pay attention to this. I'm trying to signal to you. The other thing is most people are assuming that his first trip will be to Nicaea, because this year marks the 1700th anniversary of the First Ecumenical Council of Nicaea. And so that was a trip that Francis had planned. There's the assumption that this is something that Leo will carry forward. But what he says then is, he says, we're preparing for the 1700th anniversary. He says, as Bishop of Rome, I consider one of my priorities to be that of seeking the reestablishment of full invisible communion among those who profess the same faith in God the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. So that, again, this is one of his first speeches. The audience are people who he's seeking to be in community and in communion with. So this is something that, again, we don't have a ton of this back work. He wasn't really heavily involved in interreligious dialogue or ecumenism, but this seems to be a pretty strong signal that he is hoping for unity to be a big part of his papacy. The other thing that he's been saying a lot that we haven't spoken about yet is the role of peace, right? He's almost every chance he gets, he's speaking about peace. And of course, we know that interreligious dialogue and ecumenism is bound up in topics of war and peace and nonviolence and unity. So I'm also curious if part of his approach to what the relationship between his approach to interreligious dialogue and ecumenism and his approach to peace and how those go together. But it seems like he's laying that groundwork. That's what he's telling us to be on the floor.
Yeah, I think that's something to keep an eye on, again, as these things unfold. And going back to our position of wild speculations, that's something I think to be excited and maybe hopeful for. And so as we wrap up here, I'm wondering if there is something that maybe you're excited about with this papacy and hopeful for. And if you could share that with our audience as a closing thought. And maybe Steve, would you go first?
Sure. I have a couple things. So one is the university I'm at is St. Leo, and so we're all really excited about the name. And there are people who are hoping he will come visit us, although given our rural location, I think it's unlikely. So that's one thing. Number two, I am genuinely interested and curious about what he's going to do with artificial intelligence and other technological questions, because that's my own research interests. So I'm looking forward to that. And then third, I think one of the other things I would just note is on the order of popes, he's relatively young. And so, he was 69 when he was elected, whereas I want to say Francis, I think, was 78 and Benedict was 75. And so, if his health is good and maintains and nothing else happens, he could be pope for 20 years, which is a fairly rare thing, all things considered. And so that gives him, that would give him a long range in which to have an impact on the church and on the world, which, has all sorts of positives and negatives. But I think, I think he might have a sense of he has time, that maybe the others didn't have that same sense. So.
Yeah, I think my hope overall is his election has shown that things that we thought were impossible are in fact possible, right? It was unexpected. And again, this sense of being a US born pope. So my excitement is, I don't know what to expect. Part of the excitement from that also comes from, there was a lot of talk prior of would a more conservative faction from the church elect a pope, would a more liberal faction? Are we going to have Francis 2.0? Was he going to take the name Francis II? Is he going to take the name Benedict or Pope John Paul III? What we see here is none of those. So what I'm really excited about is that he seems to be he is not able to be put into any sort of box. And I really like that. Even though it would have been nice to have a pope who's in my box, right? It shares all my beliefs. I like that he doesn't fit neatly into a category of conservative or liberal. He doesn't even fit into a category of US born, right? He defies all of our categories. He defies what's expected. And to me, that gives me hope that this will be that he will lead the church into where the church needs to go, which is different than any one of us could wildly speculate, right? That there's a faithfulness to that that I'm really excited for.
Well, thank you both, Annie and Steve, for being with us today. And thank you, audience, for being with us for this wonderful conversation. Just some housekeeping at the end. A survey is going to show up for you after you log out of today's events. Please take a few minutes to answer the questions to help us measure and improve our programming and work. Your responses are confidential. And if you are new to ICJS and want to participate in more programs like this, we encourage you to visit our website, www.icjs.org. And then finally, we are a non-sectarian, independent nonprofit, unaffiliated with any academic or religious organization, and we're supported by people like you. We strive to make all of our programs available at no cost, but we ask for support in making that work possible. So if you could donate, that would be wonderful. Thank you again, everyone, and thank you again to our wonderful speakers, and hope you have a great rest of your day.